Have you ever seen a woman disappear, not out of despair but out of decision? Not into darkness, not into weakness, but into herself. One day, quietly, she stopped answering. She didn't scream. She didn't explain. She just went silent. The kind of silence that isn't an absence, but a return to the wild, to the womb, to the original voice beneath all the noise. She turned off her phone, left a table where love had always been a performance. She unlearned the hunger to be chosen.
They said she vanished. But what they didn't know is that she arrived in a place only few women ever dare to enter, a threshold where eyes don't seek mirrors but windows, where the skin stops begging to be touched, because the soul has begun to whisper. And in that whisper something ancient rises, the memory of a time before she was taught to shrink, before the world told her that silence was loneliness, before she mistook attention for affection. She walked barefoot into her solitude, not because she was broken, but because she was done pretending, done with tight smiles at empty dinners, done with soft yeses that meant no, done carrying generations of guilt in her womb. Now when they ask, "Where is she?" they think she's hiding, but she is not hiding. She is healing, not in public, not online, but in a sacred, invisible way that the world is not ready to understand. She lit a candle no one will see. She buried the girl who waited. And gave birth to the woman who remembers that her body is not a negotiation, that her heart is not a marketplace, that her presence is not an accessory. There's a beauty that doesn't need display, a strength that doesn't need volume, a clarity that no longer begs for explanation. And now, every time she says nothing, the world grows louder in confusion. She became unreadable, and therefore unmanipulable. She became sovereign, and therefore dangerous. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And that's exactly what she's doing. In stillness, in solitude, in sacred rebellion. She didn't close herself to love. She closed herself to the noise that always came disguised as love. Because she finally realized, the woman who stops waiting is the woman who begins to live. And just when she thought the silence was the end, she felt something move inside her. A grief not hers. A weight passed down through centuries of women who were never allowed to choose themselves. She didn't know it yet, but this silence was only the beginning. A door was opening to a room she had avoided her whole life, and behind that door was the pain, the sacred, unbearable, necessary pain. It didn't happen all at once. The breaking, it came in quiet, unnoticed ways. In the sigh she held at dinner, in the way her smile stopped reaching her eyes, in the mornings where she stared at the ceiling, asking no one in particular, "Is this all there is?" She didn't scream, she didn't shatter, she slowly dimmed. Until one day she could no longer find herself in her own life. She had become a role, a function, a reliable presence in everyone's script, except her own. She remembered a time when her laughter echoed without apology, when her body felt like a temple, not a transaction, when she trusted that love would meet her where she stood, not where she stooped. But somewhere along the way, she stopped standing tall. She made herself small, quiet, soft enough not to scare anyone, useful enough not to be abandoned. She didn't choose this pain. She inherited it from her mother and her mother's mother, women who taught with glances, not words, that love is earned through sacrifice and silence is the price of survival. So she became the good woman, the giver, the peacekeeper, the one who says, "I'm fine," even when she's unraveling. And she wore that identity like armor until it became a cage. Inside, Her soul pounded against the walls, yearning to scream, to rage, to run. But how do you run from a life you built yourself? How do you leave a love that looks perfect from the outside, but feels like slow erosion from the inside? She wasn't hurt by strangers. She was hurt by proximity, by those she nurtured, who never thought to nurture her, by those who said, "I love you," but only when she was useful, by those who expected her to stay, even when they stopped seeing her. So she stayed, for the children, for the vows, for the illusion. She stayed so long she forgot that leaving was an option. She forgot that longing doesn't mean loyalty, and suffering isn't proof of love. There were nights, many nights, when she curled into herself in bed, while the man beside her slept like a stranger. She whispered questions into the dark. Why does love feel like loneliness? Why do I feel most invisible when I'm not alone? Is there something wrong with me? But no one answered, because no one was listening. Not really. They heard her voice, but not her silence. They saw her presence, but not her absence. Because she had become so good at performing the part, they forgot there was a person underneath. And when she did cry, when she finally broke the silence, they called her dramatic, too sensitive, too emotional. So she retreated again, deeper this time, beyond the reach of even herself. And that's where the real pain began, not in the loss of others, but in the loss of herself. She missed the woman she used to be, the one who dreamed, who danced without checking who was watching, who said no without guilt and yes without fear. She missed her own aliveness. Because somewhere between the expectations and the obligations, between the caregiving and the compromise, she had disappeared. And the world never noticed. Because the world doesn't mourn the woman who fades. It only mourns the woman who leaves. But inside her, something ancient stirred. A scream that had been swallowed for generations. A cry that wasn't hers alone, but belonged to every woman who had ever been told that to be good. She must disappear. It rose from her belly, from the womb that had birthed life, but was starving for her own. It rose like a storm, not to destroy, but to wake her. Wake her from the spell of pleasing, from the trance of endurance, from the lie that told her she was only worthy when needed. She stood at the edge of herself, trembling, not from weakness, but from recognition, that the life she was living was built on the ruins of the woman she could have been. And that realization broke her, not into pieces, but into truth. She saw it clearly for the first time. She had been surviving, not living, serving, not choosing, begging, not receiving. And that pain was sacred, because it meant she was waking up. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And this was her crucible. The burning she had to walk through, not to become someone else, but to remember who she was before the world forgot her. And now, she sits in silence, no longer afraid of it, because she knows the silence is not empty. It is full, full of truth, full of memory, full of the woman she buried beneath politeness and performance. She doesn't know what comes next, but she knows what cannot continue. She cannot keep shrinking to fit into lives that were never shaped for her. She cannot keep bleeding for those who never learned to heal themselves. She cannot keep explaining her needs to people committed to misunderstanding her. So she chooses, quietly, painfully, to stop waiting, to stop chasing, to stop proving. And in that stopping, something ancient returns, the wild, the raw, the untamed whisper of the self. She is not healed, but she is awake. And that is where the real journey begins. But before she can rise, she must descend further, into the roots, into the myths she inherited but never questioned. She must break the spell that told her, to be loved You must be less. Because something is coming. A truth too big for silence. A light too bright for shame. And in the next chapter, she will begin to dismantle the lies. She will remember what was stolen. And she will take it back. They told her solitude was sadness, but it was the first truth she ever chose. Before she reclaimed herself, she had to destroy what was never truly hers, not with fire, but with awareness. She began to look around, at her life, her choices, her reflections, and asked a question no one had ever allowed her to ask. Who am I when I'm not performing? Not the daughter, not the partner, not the caretaker, not the woman holding everything together while quietly falling apart. She had played the roles so well, they had become her skin. But inside, something pulsed, ancient and impatient. A knowing. A truth too loud to keep swallowing. And when she finally listened, everything began to fall. Not like a disaster, but like a curtain being drawn. She started seeing clearly. That much of what she called love was manipulation covered in affection, that the word sacrifice had been weaponized, that the family expectations she honored were never designed to honor her, that the romantic myths she clung to were written to keep her small, pleasing, dependent. That strength was never meant to mean silence. That being good had cost her her soul. She saw how early it began, the praise for being quiet, the punishment for being loud, the warning not to be too independent, or she'd scare men away, the fables of the princess rescued by a kiss, never told she could break her own spell. She saw how deeply the script had entered her, how she shaped her voice, her body, her dreams to fit a mold carved by other hands. And she felt the ache of that distortion, a sacred rage. Not against men, not against love, but against the lie. The lie that told her that her wholeness was dangerous, that her desire was shameful, that her power was a threat. And maybe it is, a threat to every system that profits from her compliance. So she stopped apologizing for wanting more, for saying no, for not smiling on cue. She let herself be misunderstood. Because she realized being understood by the wrong people was a form of self-betrayal. It wasn't graceful. The unraveling was messy. There were days she wanted to go back, to shrink, to numb, to pretend again. Because it's terrifying, to stand without the mask, to feel exposed without the armor. But it was more terrifying to stay asleep. Carl Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." But she was done avoiding. She faced the mirror, not the one on the wall, but the mirror of her lineage. And there she saw them, the tired eyes of women who had loved too hard, settled too quickly, given too much. Women who wore sorrow like second skin. Women who traded silence for safety. Women who passed down their wounds wrapped in advice. She had become them. And now, she would become something else. She would be the one who broke the pattern, not just for herself, but for all the daughters watching. So she took the myths apart, ripped the pages, burned the rules. She walked away from a life that was full, but not fulfilling. From people who didn't love her, but loved her obedience. From the voice in her head that still whispered, "Don't be too much." She told that voice, "I'd rather be too much than not enough for myself." And she began building something new. From the ashes, from the scar tissue, from the silence that now felt like sanctuary. She no longer wanted love that asked her to disappear. She no longer trusted words not backed by presence. She no longer feared being alone, because now she was finally with herself. But something lingers. A flicker, a tremble, a weight she can't yet name. She's broken the outer rules. But what about the ones buried inside her psyche? The ones she doesn't even know she follows? Because liberation is not just about walking away. It's about looking inward, And what she's about to face is not the system outside. It's the shadow within. The part of her she denied. The hunger she judged. The rage she buried. The wild she repressed. She thinks she's free. But the shadow has been waiting, watching, growing. And now it knocks, not to haunt her, but to invite her deeper. Because the woman who seeks wholeness must make peace with what she abandoned in herself. She thought healing was about light. But healing, real healing, is about truth. And truth doesn't always shine. Sometimes it whispers from the dark. It was Carl Jung who said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." So she turned inward, not to find bliss, but to face what she had buried. There, in the sacred quiet of her solitude, she met her shadow. It didn't look like a monster. It looked like her, but unloved. The parts she had disowned, the woman who was angry, the one who wanted too much, the one who wasn't soft, or sweet, or small. She saw the versions of herself she had punished for not fitting the mold, the sexual, intuitive, chaotic one, the one who said no too loudly, the one who dared to say yes to her own pleasure, her own path, her own pace. All of them were waiting, not to be fixed, but to be seen, to be reclaimed. Because the woman who wants to awaken must also remember what she abandoned to be accepted. She wept, not out of weakness, but recognition. She saw how many times she betrayed herself for love, for peace, for approval. How many dreams she edited to fit into smaller lives. How many boundaries she softened just to be less threatening. And she forgave herself. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Because she realized, wholeness isn't about being good. It's about being complete. She began to integrate. The fire with the softness, the shadow with the light, the wild with the wise. And in that union, a new archetype emerged. Not the princess, not the martyr, not the seductress, but the sovereign, the woman who belongs to herself. She doesn't ask to be chosen. She chooses. She doesn't wait for permission. She creates her own rhythm. She doesn't dim to comfort others. She stands, fully lit. Jung called this the process of individuation, the sacred path of becoming whole. And now she walks it. Not to become perfect, but to become real. Not to be understood, but to be embodied. Not to be adored, but to be alive. She no longer sees her solitude as a wound, but as a womb, a place of rebirth, a portal to deeper knowing, a temple where she meets the parts of herself the world tried to erase. And in that temple, she no longer begs for love. She becomes it. But what happens when a woman becomes whole? When she is no longer afraid of her own depths? When she no longer flees her anger, her desire, her truth? The world begins to shift around her. People leave, masks fall, systems tremble. Because a woman who has faced her own shadow cannot be controlled. She walks differently, speaks less, but says more, loves fiercely, but never desperately. She is not here to please. She is here to remember. And every step she takes now echoes not just in her own life, but in the bones of every woman who forgot how to belong to herself. But the journey isn't over, because once she meets the shadow, she must now rise. Not as a reaction, not in rebellion, but in reclamation. The return of the feminine is not a war cry, it's a remembering. And the woman she's becoming is not a version, she's a revolution. She becomes her own sanctuary. The sovereign woman rises. She didn't come back softer, she came back sacred. After walking through fire, not once but in 1,000 small ways, she stopped waiting to be saved. She realized no one was coming. Not the partner, not the parent, not the friend. Not even God in the form she was taught to believe in. Because salvation, for her, was not arrival, it was return. Return to the self, the original self, before the edits, before the shame, before the compromise. She stopped asking, "What do they want from me?" and began asking, "What do I want from me?" No longer a daughter of duty, no longer a woman for rent, no longer a soul on pause, waiting for permission. She stood, not as a symbol, but as a source. She was no longer seeking to be chosen. She had already chosen herself. Her mornings became rituals. Silence became devotion. Her body, a temple no longer for others to visit, but for herself to inhabit. She dressed for her own reflection, moved with a grace that came from grief transmuted, spoke less but with more gravity. She began saying no with calm, not explanation. She no longer entertained connections that diluted her. She was no longer seduced by potential, only by presence. And when love appeared again, she didn't run. But she didn't collapse either. She met it eye to eye, as a sovereign, because now she knew the difference between being needed and being seen. This woman doesn't ask for peace. She is peace. Not because life stopped hurting, but because she stopped abandoning herself every time it did. She no longer fears solitude. She resides in it. She no longer escapes into company. She invites it from a place of overflow. The girl who once begged to be loved became the woman who walks with love inside her ribcage. And that changed everything. Now people meet her and feel something unfamiliar. Stillness, power, truth. They can't name it, but their nervous systems recognize it, because the world is not used to a woman who doesn't flinch, who doesn't shrink, who doesn't barter her worth for comfort. She has become a sanctuary, a mirror, a threshold. Not everyone can walk with her, not because she's better, but because she's clear. And clarity is uncomfortable for those who still live in confusion. She walks slowly now, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence. Because she knows every step she takes is ancestral, every boundary she holds is holy, every breath she reclaims is revolution. And now, something even deeper is awakening. Not a reaction, not a rebellion, but a remembering of a truth older than language, a presence that doesn't need to explain itself. Because the woman who no longer needs love to survive is finally ready to love without fear. She is not healing to become lovable, she is healing to become whole, not for them, for her, for the girl who never felt enough, for the woman who spent years giving everything except herself to herself. Now finally, she remembers what they tried to make her forget, that she is not a half looking to be completed. She is a universe, vast, sacred, uncharted. She no longer walks into rooms wondering, will they like me? Now she wonders, do I feel free here? She no longer watches her words to keep others comfortable. She speaks them with care, but never with compromise. She doesn't perform softness to be palatable. She doesn't fake laughter to avoid tension. She knows that sometimes truth is the most intimate sound a soul can make. She no longer wears dresses she doesn't love, eats meals she doesn't enjoy, stays in rooms that drain her. Every detail of her life has become a sacred yes. She has redefined love, not as sacrifice but as resonance, not as saving but as standing, not as begging to be chosen, but as choosing to stay only where her soul feels safe to unfold. They say she is too much, too intense, too intuitive, too expressive, but they forget. She had to become this much to survive how little she once received, and now she refuses to shrink, not for comfort, not for approval, not for anyone. She doesn't need an audience anymore. Her joy is private. Her rituals are silent. Her devotion is inward. She waters herself, lights her own candle, takes herself by the hand on stormy nights and whispers, "We're not lost. We're in bloom." She no longer runs from her shadow. She dances with it, weaves it into her voice, lets it sit at the table with her light. Because she knows power is not purity, it's integration. She is not all calm. She is storm and silence, moon and magma, wound and wonder. She does not call everyone sister. She does not keep everyone close. Because now she understands, not everyone can walk with her. Not everyone deserves access to her sacred fire. She is open, but she is guarded. She is generous, but she is no longer porous. She is warm, but she doesn't burn herself to keep others from feeling cold. She doesn't need to be chased. She needs to be met. In depth, in presence, in truth. And if that doesn't come, she walks on. Not bitter. Not wounded, just wise. She doesn't fight to be understood anymore. She is not a manual. She is a mystery. Not to confuse, but to protect the parts of her that bloomed in silence. She doesn't need validation for her path, because her feet know the ground they walk on now. And it's hers. She doesn't say yes out of fear. She doesn't say no out of guilt. She says both from clarity, from embodiment, from sovereignty. Because finally, she has remembered. The body doesn't lie. The soul doesn't beg. And the woman who knows herself doesn't need permission. And in her silence now, there is no emptiness. There is music, ritual, ancestral memory. There is the echo of the women who came before her, cheering her rise. There is the whisper of future daughters, feeling a new blueprint written in her name. She is not asking the world for space. She is space. She is the room. She is the altar. And every time she chooses herself over approval, over urgency, over fear, a new world is built around her. She is not waiting to be seen. She is seeing. She is not afraid of being alone. She is in communion. She is not falling behind. She is in divine timing. She is not hardened. She is whole. She is not for everyone, but she is not here for everyone. She is here for truth, for depth, for soul, for the woman inside her that waited decades to be chosen. And now, finally, she is. But this is not the end. Because now that she knows her power, now that she walks with her light and her shadow, a new question rises. What will she do with this clarity? What kind of love will she allow? What kind of legacy will she leave? What kind of sisterhood will she call forth? Because a woman who has become herself can no longer live as anything less than sacred. If these words touched something you didn't even know had a name, if your eyes welled up not out of sadness, but because someone finally put into language what your soul has been whispering for years, then this message was for you. You don't need to rush. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to remember. You were never missing, only misplaced beneath all the roles you played to survive. And now, you're being called back. Back to your body. Back to your truth. Back to the quiet knowing that was always there, beneath the noise of being useful, likable, needed. You don't need to perform peace anymore. You can become it, in your rhythm, in your sacred pace, in your own sacred flame. I invite you now, not as a creator, but as a companion on this path. Leave a comment below. Let this not be just a video you watched, but a space you entered. Tell me, what part of you no longer fits inside the life you once called yours? What are you being called to release or reclaim? Right from the soul. No masks here. Use the sacred word, desperta. So I know you're not watching this from the surface, but from the place where real change begins. Share this video with one woman, not with many, just one. The one you thought of when your heart stirred, the one who's been too quiet. The one whose light has dimmed, but who still carries an ember inside. Maybe she doesn't need advice. Maybe she just needs a mirror. And maybe this was it. Subscribe if you feel the call. Not because everyone else does, but because you want to walk this path, deliberately, devoutly, not as content, but as remembrance. This space was not made for the masses. It was made for women who are tired of sleeping. If you are one of them, you're already home. We're here. In silence, in truth, intacta.